Welcome to the Assembly of Silence Radio Hour.
Okay, here we go. Another episode featuring Jeff. In this episode, we start off by talking about prediction and control. It goes all over the place. It's a really great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. If you want to support the show, you know what to do. Links in the show description. You can go to Patreon. You can do the crypto thing. You can just tell everyone you know so that there's more audience and it feels like I have more of a reason to do this than I would otherwise. That's all I got to say. Enjoy the show. And by all means, tell me what you think about it. Okay, that's enough. Here we go.
Just doing that, and then I should be able to see level. Oh yeah, we're seeing level. Okay. Okay, yes, so we're here with Jeff once again. What are we talking about? We just went through about half a dozen topics in the pre-show segment. The part of the show that wasn't recorded.
Right.
And which one of those can we still remember?
Right, where we try to figure out how to narrow down the topic of conversation just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, there was this, one of the things that first came up was the human tendency to want to be able to predict, right? And you see that in all kinds of different ways. It's sort of one of our main activity. It's kind of, we all want to know what's going to happen. We want to be able to have some sense of certainty about where everything is going. And my gut feeling about it is that that's part of the reason why we keep heading towards such a mess. It's sort of like the more that we got our predictive capability, quote unquote, together, and we're able to sort of control the outcome of things, the more we kind of became responsible for what we could then predict would be a mess. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. That's just my hunch, because apparently, according to one of my devoted listeners, I have a negativity bias. So maybe the ideas that I come up with are kind of just shaded by my overall sense of doom, which was one of the other topics that we had considered.
Well, I guess the sense of doom is a good thing to pair with the topic of what can we predict. Because I think they're tied together. I think we want to be able to predict things because we want to avoid bad things happening.
Yep.
But if it were that simple, then I think there are an awful lot of bad things that have happened that we could have avoided. I don't know if that's a funny thing to say or scary or what.
Well, I mean, you could say that humanity has definitely gotten better in our predictive abilities, right? Like for a long time, we really couldn't predict the weather particularly well. We couldn't predict the position of the planets and what have you. But certainly, we haven't been able to change whether or not bad things are going to happen. Mm-hmm. Some extraordinarily bad things have happened pretty recently, and, So, I think that it's worth meditating on the one of the fundamental biblical concepts of what it means to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because apparently the original meaning of the terms good and evil in Hebrew meant something a little bit more like advantage and disadvantage. So in some respects, that's saying, wanting to be able to know what the outcome of something is going to be. So instead of just accepting the earth the way it was, kind of wanting to be able to game the system and get as much upside without the downside. But it's sort of like once you separate the upside from the downside, it seems like what ends up happening is you get an accumulation of downside, in a kind of yin-yang theory type way of looking at it. And so we by being able to refine positive vibes, we end up creating a vast reservoir of negativity that we eventually have to deal with.
Does it have to be balanced? Is there a law of negativity and positivity in our experiential set of our life.
Well, I mean, we have life and then we have death, right? So the two things are married to each other. We don't get one without the other. You know, I don't care what Ray Kurzweil says. You know,
I care a lot about what he says, but I don't like most of it.
It's strange where that guy has gone. You know, I mean, I was a huge fan of the Kurzweil synthesizer. It was, you know, kind of a world that I occupied for a long time, and was extremely impressed with it when it first came out. And so I was really kind of amazed to discover that this guy wasn't dedicated to building synthesizers. He had other things in mind. So when he ended up becoming this transhumanist icon, I was kind of horrified and amazed. But there you go, another topic.
Right. It's a little bit amazing that someone who's so intelligent and talks about spirituality and technology in the same sort of vein doesn't really give any evidence of ever having had a spiritual experience in any of the ways he talks or any of the references that I've seen him make.
Well, I think, like, you know, actual tangible evidence of spiritual experience is pretty hard to come by with anyone. You know, I think it's kind of a very, very, it's probably like one of the most personal aspects of existence. It's an entirely internal process, and it usually gets all mangled once you try to express it. So, you know,
that's true.
It does seem, I mean, maybe he had a spiritual impulse at one point, you know, and this happens, I think, quite often as someone experiences something, let's say, out of the ordinary, and it inspires them in a certain direction. And maybe that was like the last time they experienced anything from that domain, and they just kind of continue on as if, you know, the material world were the main thing again, you know? Because that seems to be the basic dialectic, is between kind of the quote-unquote spiritual world and the quote-unquote material world, and what's meant by that, you know, is I mean, in some way, I think it's self-evident, you know, because you can think about your existence in a material sense. So you can be all preoccupied with how are things going to turn out, how am I going to get what I want, which is this whole predictive concern, right? Future, future, future. How do I deal with this physical body and all the various physical things that I have to deal with and all the others and everything like that? And that can completely consume one's attention, right? But there is this other realm that's available to all of us that has nothing to do with any of that. And so let's just call that the spiritual realm, right? The thing that isn't where, you know, where our consciousness and our senses are not just completely engaged in trying to figure out how to make this physical thing work. Because I think even if you don't have a spiritual orientation, you can notice, dealing with the material world over and over again, that all of our best efforts are, you know, partially successful at best, you know, and that quite often the things that we're hoping to bring about end up not happening the way we wanted to. There's all sorts of unintended consequences, and just things can go horribly wrong really quickly, even when you're really doing your best. So the material world has a tendency to be very slippery, and it doesn't really respond in entirely predictable ways. And that's why we're frustrated, and that's why we want to be able to predict and be able to ideally get a better fix on it. But that seems like a futile effort, you know, and many of the spiritual traditions, like, you know, the Bible is just one, but there's many that say that, you know, the material world is the world of illusion, and we're always going to be frustrated in our ability to grasp it and get control over it. And so maybe really, you know, we are being asked to spend more time in the spiritual domain. You know, I'd say, like, in some senses, that's pretty much what this podcast is about.
Right.
You know, it's a negotiation, because as long as we're in a physical body, this is what's going on, you know? And we're not going to be around much longer unless we learn to become a breatharian if we don't deal with the physical world in some way or another. So it's always going to be a component as long as we're living and breathing, but we really are missing out on an incredible opportunity in life if all we do is think about the material.
Okay, so where does that leave us?
Well, it leaves us with a picture of what's going on now in terms of the topics we're talking about. Mm-hmm. The way our society works, and particularly the aspect of it that we call capitalism, keeps people struggling to meet their material, physical needs. Not all of them, but most of the people are caught in that material place where they have to focus on meeting their material needs.
Yeah.
And because so many people are really trapped, absolutely trapped by fear of death, literally the experience of having to die because you don't have enough,
right,
is something that large portions of the planet are still going through on a daily basis, when for many, many decades we've had more than enough stuff for everybody to live a different style of conscious life wherein they don't have to struggle for their material existence.
Well, I guess that to some extent is debatable depending upon the quality of the stuff we're talking about.
That would be very highly debated by most politicians and people who have a stake in the system as it is.
Before we get too far,
to do their work.
but before we get too far from it, I would say that it's really not just the capitalist system that has those properties to it. That most systems of governance, people are pretty well involved in just making it from day to day. That's the primary thing going on, So all the way from, although they do say that back in the hunter-gatherer days, we spent an average of 3 or 4 hours a day trying to meet our needs, So who knows? I mean, there were probably some periods where you would have to spend an awful lot and that you wouldn't be able to make your needs given whatever, even your best efforts, depending upon the environmental conditions of at the time, what the weather had been like, etc. All kinds of different periods of time. But yeah, I think probably in human history there have been some periods where people really didn't have to struggle as hard as we do now. And then the question of, okay, well, could something like Andrew Yang's universal basic income work? Because basically for $1,000 a month, as long as the currency doesn't collapse, a few adults could get together and have a decent household and live relatively comfortably instead of being constantly fearful that they're going to be living in the street. And so it seems like a no-brainer that, we really, particularly in the face of, as Yang points out, automation and artificial intelligence, which is likely to displace jobs across the job market, not just in the lower-paying jobs, but even like lawyers and doctors could be replaced by many of these devices. So it seems only reasonable that our society is going to have to find some way of being able to take care of even the least of us, as they would say in the old days, right? Mm-hmm. And everyone should have at least a little bit of the pie. And, what's wrong with that? Why can't we do that? That seems like I know that there are some good economic reasons why we can't, I'm going to put can't in the air quotes there, can't do that. There's like a kind of practical level where you have to understand how capital works, right? So it's sort of like, they do have that power and that money, and they can take that power and that money and put it where they want to. So are we in a position right now where we could say, no, you can't take all your money out of a country that decides to give everyone $1,000 a month? It's like we don't really have that power. That's the problem with left-leaning governments is they get into power, and then the people who have the money and the power say, oh, okay, have a good time. We're taking our business elsewhere. And the next thing you know, like everyone hates that left-wing government because they've got nothing. It's like what happened in Greece, right? Greece, in the middle of their crisis, they elect a left-wing government. It's like, oh, finally, we got some left-wingers in it. And the next thing you know, that government is imposing austerity on the country because they have no option. And then you have a rise of an even more intense right wing.
This is something that has confused me, and I think it's maybe my own lack of will to look into the details of how horrific it is. But has anybody just ever told the IMF to go screw themselves? Like, why? This is like a major problem in the world, the way the World Bank works, the way the IMF works, the way the international community of governance works. it's actually not working for most of the human beings on the planet. It's like a
Yeah.
really violent, oppressive system that just keeps running around to different countries and extracting resources at a breathtaking pace and leaving destruction in its wake.
Pretty much. I mean, it's the John Perkins story.
So
right?
at what point does a country like, say, Greece say, you know what? You tricked us into all these terrible situations, and you're going to destroy the people's lives in this country where you're trying to extract all this extra energy.
Yeah.
And we're just not going to give it to you because you don't need it, and we do.
Yeah. I think that's basically, I think that's what they did in Iceland.
Okay.
You know,
Iceland seemed to have worked out quite well.
It
for
actually
people
does
who
seem to
live
work
in
out
Iceland.
quite well, yeah. And I think they're also one of the very few nations that actually went after the bankers responsible for making these really screwed up deals with, you know, the IMF and their ilk. You know, I'm not an expert in all of that, but I've seen enough information that I think you're absolutely right. That's an organization that extends loans that cause incredible hardship for the people of a nation, basically disenfranchises them from their own country, and allows resource extraction at cut-rate discounts for international corporations. It's just a freaking nightmare. But again, you know, maybe there's some information I don't really fully have on that, but it seems like that is pretty much the game. And I think a good book on that subject, one that I did read, is John Perkins' Confession of an Economic Hitman. He pretty much lays it out there. So I have yet to see anyone criticize his picture of things in a compelling or reasonable way. So it does seem like that. But it's like, okay, so we have maybe one nation that said, no thank you, IMF and everything that goes along with you. But that doesn't stop the IMF from continuing to do what it does, right? So it's this agency out there that's continuing to wreak damage, you know?
What's the critical resource that we need from Iceland? Because I know in Bolivia they have lithium.
Huh.
Lots of it.
That's
like
a good
most of
point,
it.
yeah.
You know, these other places, I mean, we've the United States has not been successful in throwing over the government in Venezuela, but we know what they have that we want.
Right.
I mean, we're hanging around in Syria after creating a mess there to protect a couple of broken oil wells that have a fraction of the world's oil.
No,
but that's
it's not.
still what we're saying we're
Well,
doing.
that's-
Like, what would have been in the past looked upon as a motivation that I think we would have disparaged is now just being casually thrown out as an excuse for something even worse that we're doing.
Well, I think Syria is probably more of a political thing having to do with Iran, but I don't know. It's complicated.
That's what I'm getting at. I mean, we're now using, we're just there to steal the oil.
Yeah,
as the
no.
excuse to do even
It's
more
amazing
nefarious things.
that now is the excuse.
That's now an acceptable
Yeah.
excuse.
It
We're
used
just
to be
there to take their oil and make it ours.
It used to be that they would say like, "Oh, we're trying to bring democracy to
Right.
the rest, to the, you know, trying to free people and stuff like that." Now at least they're saying, "Well, yeah, we're just here to steal the oil." But now even that's a lie. You're probably right. I don't know. I mean, Iceland, as far as I know, it's like you got Bjork and some really good lamb. I don't know what else comes out of Iceland. Their geothermal system, but that's not an export. So
I think it just was able to happen there because it's small enough and isolated enough. But if, say, the yellow vests and the black vests in France get together and just say, you know what, enough is enough. We're going to do this right here in France.
right.
And we're going to show the world how it's done again. This time, though, we're not going to get out the guillotines. We're going to do it in a very intellectual, compassionate sort of way, but we're not going to participate anymore. What if the French did it? You know, they're right there in the middle of Europe.
I mean, they're sort of trying to, you know, it's not about that issue, but on some level, the people there are making a stand, and they're just getting beaten down. Mm-hmm. You know, so I think you're right that you know the reason why. Well, there's another factor too, which is that Iceland has one of the most genetically similar populations in the world.
Oh, interesting.
So, like, everyone is can relate to each other. They're all kind of coming from the same place, you could say. Right.
So when the police are beating up the protesters in Iceland, they're literally beating up their cousins.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I think people have a sense of common identity there.
Right.
Like they're all really, and here in the United States, where we've lost the sense of what it means to be like that. Everyone here is an American.
Right.
Like so
they're pushing really hard on that one. That certain people should be allowed to be Americans and others should not.
Well, I mean, how would the Icelandics feel if, all of a sudden the idea was proposed that anyone could be an Icelander? Just show up and you can be part of our society too. I think they'd be like, no.
Right.
No, we won't go for that. I mean, I know most nations won't go for that.
Yeah.
And I think most populations wouldn't be comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And there's some good reasons for that.
Well, that leaves us with a big problem because there's lots of places where people are not going to be able to live, where lots and lots of people have been living. It's starting, it's happening now, and it's creating a big problem. What happens when it's 10 times this large?
Oh my God! I mean, yeah, the dislocated populations are it's really hard to imagine how that problem isn't going to get worse and worse.
Well, and I think all of these problems are just going to pinch the human way of life on planet Earth from all directions until we have to finally make some real assessments that actually lead to material changes in the way we operate. Otherwise, if you take the prediction.
Yeah,
kind of. You take the energy we have now and the direction that we're headed, and you make some predictions. We're not, as a species, going to survive the wheels we've set in motion.
Well, certainly not as we have been surviving.
No, certainly not.
So one of the biggest problems is that when you have a system that gets overextended and kind of long in the tooth and weak in various ways, and yet is still basically the way the world works, particularly because there's so much resistance to change, it gets incredibly difficult to modify it. Almost just on the basis of inertia and resistance and the hostility that comes up whenever real change is proposed, let alone implemented, right? And then all of the kind of dirty tricks that can be played against those who are trying to make some sort of change occur. All of that basically means that you get this residue of the system that kind of clings on for the last remaining breath, and because of that, you don't get a soft landing. You tend to get a collapse. Mm-hmm. If there was a bit more of a cooperative, incremental way of going about changing a system, that seems like, in some ways maybe democracy is a little better at that type of thing than a lot of other systems because, for so long as we have civil discourse and, anyone can enter the political arena and you can have this potential for various movements that can get a degree of political foothold and make some change, and obviously that has been eroded to a large extent.
I was going to say, I'm not sure if I would really try to make any of these claims and stand behind them.
Well, I mean, we have some candidates who have a fair amount of political power. I mean, Sanders is a moderate socialist, for instance, and I'm not a fan of his ideas in general, but he does represent a change to the system, and the system is rejecting him. Even his own part. I mean, he was only recently, I guess, a Democrat. So I guess that's part of the problem they have with him. But he's probably the most popular candidate they have. But even someone like, Tulsi Gabbard, who doesn't have nearly as many people as Sanders, she has, I think, had an impact on the political spectrum. She's got a strong message, and I think it's a testament that there's still some residue of democracy happening here, that she can get, as much of a voice as she has. I think that she's unfairly suppressed. I think so is Sanders, and so is Yang, and so are basically all the interesting, potentially transformative political figures on the right as well, So it's unfortunate that the system does that, but at least these people aren't like thrown into prison or just outright executed, which is what happens in other nations. So there is some degree of political freedom here still, and I don't know that it's going to last, but it is what I think makes it possible that our system could have a transformative process that would eventually lead to a different way of doing things that wouldn't just be an outright collapse. But
so let me ask you a provocative
question. It's not
question.
looking great for
Let's say I'm kind of warm to your idea here.
Okay.
What would be the turning point in your idea where you would have to say, maybe not? What would have to happen for you to kind of head in the other direction on that and be like, you know what? All of this guise of democracy and public discourse and all that, it's actually just a big dog and pony show, and we are as controlled as they are in Bolivia or Brazil. Our government is just a different flavor of the same thing. Like what? Because what I see is that the story that you present of our democracy maybe being a little better and having more of a shot could also be a situation where they're just a lot better at making it look like that, and we're a lot more gullible about believing that.
No, you're absolutely right. But on
I'm just curious how you make those distinctions.
Well, it is tricky, and I think part of it is that I'm unwilling to really make a prediction because I don't think that a prediction is a useful tool. I think that fundamentally we're operating in the realm of ideas here, and that ideas do fundamentally change things. If you can get an idea from one brain into another, and it doesn't just die there, and it kind of continues to move from brain to brain, who knows what can happen. That's really kind of my basic mode of operation. So, I also believe that you don't know, even when things look really terrible, whether or not they're going to be able to pull off their evil schemes. So it's like, I could see like we get to the point where, everyone has the chip implanted in the back of their head, and it's all like social credits, and every like wrong thought that you make deducts something from your social credit score. Right. I'd be more tempted to say, yeah, it's not looking good. And on some level, that is kind of a system that's, it seems like it's more integrated into Chinese society right now, but it's, it's on its way here in one way or another. But I do think that, like all plans, they can go awry, and there can be unintended consequences that even the most brilliant Dr. Evil can't quite take into consideration. They have the same problem that we all have when it comes to predicting the future. And when they're trying to implement whatever system of control it is that they want, it's like, the material world is what it is. It doesn't want to be controlled. And I think that, I do think that fundamentally we are heading towards human societies that are going to be more tightly controlled just because of our populations. I think, unless that changes, I don't see how we're going to be able to continue as a densely populated species on the planet. But, whether or not that means that people are going to have a worse experience of life and are going to have to struggle even more in order to make it from day to day, I don't know. Not necessarily. It could be that, you would have a more efficient level playing field if you have a system that isn't completely corrupt and that isn't just serving oligarchs. You could potentially design a system that would be more equitable and allow a basic level of existence for people that would be less painful and miserable and fear laden. But I don't know. I'm not someone who's going to say, I think, it's in God's hands. We don't know. The best we can do is to try to understand things and basically do what we got to do, deal with our own world as best we can and just try to understand a broad picture. And I don't think there's much more that we can do. I'm not even sure that it's worth trying to start some kind of organization or movement or to advocate for anything in particular. I kind of just think it's like it's mainly understand things as best you can, love God, do the best you can in your life and with the people in your life, and that's kind of the recipe forward because of this unintended consequence thing. You know, we're going to have to deal with all the unintended consequences. And the basic model that I think we're in is we have a late stage global system going on right now, and it's becoming increasingly chaotic. And so the last thing that a chaotic system needs is more stuff going on. You know, if you're in a very chaotic situation, making a lot of dramatic gestures and trying to get something to happen just adds to the chaos. So that's why I don't really think that it makes a hell of a lot of sense to do much right now. You know, it's like what Slavoj Žižek says. You know, there's that old phrase of like, don't just sit there, do something, right? He says, don't just do something, sit there. And what he means is think, you know, sit there and think. Let's sit here and look at what's going on instead of just being reactive and like running around yelling and screaming about shit that we don't understand. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I just went off there.
No, it's good. I think not understanding is a manufactured situation. And lots of people don't understand lots of things, not because they're difficult to understand, but because other people want it that way.
I think there's that, but I also think that there's not that many people really that interested in understanding shit.
Well, right, because they are actually caught in that realm where they're interested in making their material needs.
Yeah, or distractions. You know.
That right. So we have all of those things.
Yeah.
What do you think that people that have money and power now are predicting is going to happen? Because whether we can make predictions or not, maybe we can get inside the heads of people that have a lot of money and a lot of power and have been running this scheme for decades. They've got to be wondering what's going to happen, I think, don't you?
Well, okay, I saw an interview recently with a woman who was the consort of Timothy Leary. I forgot her name. And this is very typical of me. I can never remember the details of what it is that I'm talking about, but it doesn't really matter, right?
The important thing is the idea.
Okay, so she is someone who came from an incredibly wealthy family, and she said a number of things that are really important. One thing she said is that the people at the top, they don't pay taxes. And like taxes are for other, like they are at a level that's just like, you know, it's left the stadium. It's completely like living above everything else.
Nobody's even looking for them to pay taxes.
Yeah, it's like not even going to be a consideration. You know, they're just way beyond that. So, and she says it's like we're talking about a number that's somewhere in like the mid hundreds, something. The people who are operating on that kind of a level, and she says that she was raised in a way where, with such cunning and such coldness, that was specifically designed to extinguish her empathy. Because if she did retain any empathy for humanity in general, she would not be suitable to protect what it is that they had acquired. So basically, like, there is a kind of dehumanizing process built into the super elites, let's say, that's a requirement for them in order to maintain their position, right? So what are they thinking? Like, and that gives you kind of a sense of the psychology of, let's say, some, maybe not all, but some, and probably the ones who protect whatever it is that they have the best have that kind of a mindset. So what are those kind of people thinking about the future, and what is their attitude towards global issues? You know, it's probably what we would imagine Dr. Evil would be doing. You know, Dr. Evil's a pretty good model for that kind of a mindset. You know, maybe Dr. Evil loves his cat, right? But beyond that, probably even his own family members are hostile agents to him, right? And that, I guess, has always been the lot of those at the top.
Like a king has no friends, only subjects, right? So it goes with the territory. That's why they say power corrupts, right? So then the question is, well, does being in that kind of a position make it more or less likely that one is able to execute plans successfully? And I don't know. I guess you could say that empathy might be the kind of thing that would get in the way of a lot of plans. So maybe some of the obstacles that those of us who do retain some degree of empathy, some of the obstacles that we have when we're trying to do things are not obstacles for them.
Right. It sets up an interesting situation where we potentially have a group. It doesn't matter if it's one person or a group of people, but we have a great deal of power concentrated. Call it in the form of money, call it in the form of political strings that can be pulled. It all comes back down to this concept of power, which is that when, two entities disagree, the one with more power is the one that ends up getting their way. And so
pretty much, right?
So there's been this exercise of power over human beings that, in my humble opinion, is definitely lacking of a certain sense of empathy or compassion.
Absolutely.
And that's a defining characteristic of how power is being wielded on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And so it paints this picture of human beings that are psychopathic, or at least, as you say, conditioned out of empathy and compassion. I think technically there's a term for that, and it's called psychopathy, which I think is also a natural condition that people can be born into.
Mm-hmm.
And it may just be that people who are in power, who are inbreeding, are more likely to end up with a psychopathic mindset because of genetics. But I don't know. That's kind of a moot point after a certain point.
Well, it would be interesting to see if you could make a distinction between what's psychopathic and what's just like very strong in-group preference. Because I know that, traditionally cultures would have a tendency to demonize other cultures, particularly ones that they had been in conflict with for a long time. And so they might have the tendency to behave very aggressively towards people from these other cultures that they perceived as being an enemy, something along those lines. And so, people can be incredibly vicious externally, incredibly kind internally when it comes to strong cultural, traditions, something along those lines. So I wonder if, that's not kind of just a similar thing that's happening on an economic level. It's not so much cultural, but you get these kind of economic groups that form on a basis not so much of genetic, genetic identity, but more their position with, class, basically, right?
Right.
So it seems like there's something along those lines, that
it's a state of consciousness identity, if you want to look at it that way, where they have this state of consciousness that allows them to be so predatory and lacking of compassion that they can play in that group.
Well, I guess, basically all identity is fundamentally a state of consciousness, right?
Right.
Because it's just what you're paying attention to in the other and in yourself that is the formation of an identity. Because you could always, pay attention to some other aspects of the people who you consider to be this or that identity or yourself. You can always reframe yourself in other ways. It's difficult to do that if you're really committed to an identity, but certainly once you recognize that there are things about yourself that you hadn't yet incorporated into your identity, there's an opportunity right there to reconsider your identity. And similarly with others, when you start to notice that they don't always behave according to the idea that you have of them, that's a pretty good opportunity to think about, reconsider the identity that you've ascribed to them.
Are these people just so trapped in their identity that they're never they're never going to. I mean, it comes back to having spiritual experiences too, doesn't it? I mean, that's
potentially, but I think sometimes people choose an identity much in the same way that an organism chooses an ecological niche. Because it just kind of works. It's like there's a place where I can hang out and do my thing, and I've got my group, and it's like I can identify with that in the sense that it will work for me. And I think some people will have a very lively, broad kind of spiritual domain within that context, and they've just associated with a particular identity, and others maybe not so much of a spiritual access there. I think that would probably still be somewhat of a standout type of, not a very common phenomena would be my guess, but I think that does happen. And in some ways, humanity is like a microcosm of the ecosystem. We've got all different kinds of people doing all different kinds of things, and they're thinking all different kinds of things, and they see themselves in all kinds of different ways,
right.
And a lot of other species are, they're kind of like one-trick ponies. They do a certain thing,
Right.
A little bit of variation around the edges,
right.
But, we're really like a whole ecosphere in ourselves.
It's an interesting model. If you were to model all of our different activities and personality types as if they were, different species in a broad ecosystem with different niches in it, it would be very interesting to study, okay, so what is this niche of the most powerful humans? What's it look like? I don't even know if we know who these people are. Like, I imagine the royal family might make it into that category. I don't necessarily imagine any of the billionaires that we're told about are even there or not. I don't know.
Yeah,
they just seem like a bunch of jerks that somebody should just stab them with a pencil when they walk down the street and call it a day.
Well, none of these people can walk down the street. That's like beyond.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, no, there's no way, right? Or if they do, they would have to completely, be cloaked, and it would be like an operation.
If I saw Jeff Bezos and Henry Kissinger walking down the street, I wouldn't know which one to kick in the
Yeah,
nuts.
I wonder if, of course, Bezos is another person we know about, right? And he is, I think actually he just got edged out by Bill Gates. He's the richest man in the world.
I heard that. I was like, I thought Bill Gates was off the list a long time ago. He's back.
Well, that guy's a tough, he's not going to be taken down that easily. So, Jeff and Bill are going to have a duke out, and everyone knows their names. So richest people in the world? Really? I don't know. I'm not sure. I wouldn't be so sure. My guess is that's
I think
kind
they
of
pay taxes. Don't they?
I think that they would be...
At least someone's looking for them to pay taxes.
I think they would be in serious trouble if they didn't. I'm sure that's monitored.
You know what I mean? I don't think they're part of that club of people
I don't think they're part of that club.
Don't even pay taxes.
So if that's the case...
I want to know who those people are.
I don't.
I don't know who they are.
I want to stay as far away from them as possible. I don't want to know anything about them. Yeah.
But they're really screwing it up for the rest of us. And that's just my opinion. But
I don't even know that. I honestly can't say for sure that that's the case. When it comes to the how bad things could be, right? The bottom is so low of how bad things could be. So if they have anything to do with what's going on now, let's just give them a C minus. Let's say C minus, because we could have already had a major global nuclear war, right?
Only because of their previous machinations.
I don't know. Who knows what the hell they're thinking? We don't know. We really don't know. We could say like basically they're just self-serving, but self-serving also means that they don't want to live in a nuclear wasteland. It also means that they don't want like massive numbers of people destroying everything by rioting. Why would
that's the situation that's been created though, and they're the ones who have the power. They have the power.
There's a little bit of that, but okay. But also, first of all, the power there is no absolute power except for God, let's say. And even there's a good question as to what absolute power means in a divine spiritual concept, right? Because, you could say that of all power there is in the universe, that would be something that divine consciousness would be able to wield, but it may also not produce exactly what that consciousness wants, and it may also have some really rough consequences for everything when it gets mobilized. So that's why they say God is slow to anger. And also, if you look in the Bible, it's like, oh yeah, God set it up this way, but then it kind of turned out different. You know, like that's a theme that happens over and over and over and over again. So it's pretty clear that we're not really talking about absolute power in the complete way. And so, okay, back to Earth, right? The elites, the creme of the creme elites, or the scum of the scum elites, if you like. Whatever power they have, I think, is subject to the same kind of limitations. You know, they probably are able to make a whole bunch of shit happen. But whether or not that produces the desired results is a whole other story, and is still a limit to what power can do in the material world. It's just built into the fabric of existence. So I'm really not 100% on board with the idea that everything is these people's fault, and you know they have some kind of an evil plan to fuck up the entire planet. It's like, you know, we're kind of all involved in this project of fucking up the planet. It's a cooperative venture. You know, you could say that. I'm sorry, I'm going on and on, but okay, last little bit, right? Lynn Margulis, microbiologist, she makes the point that the greatest catastrophe in the history of life on Earth was when the single-celled anaerobic bacteria produced so much oxygen that it became toxic to them, and they basically like choked themselves out, and that's what created, the air that we're breathing, and also eukaryotic cells, where you'd have mitochondria inside of a cell. So it's sort of like there is this basic property of life creating the conditions that suck for it. That's the way it goes. It's thermodynamic. It's like we eat and we shit, right? So the shit is what we don't want, and all organisms are producing this effluence that they don't want to be around all the time. And so when we become a densely populated species, we're producing all kinds of shit. It's not just our own biological shit. It's like all the waste product from our manufacturing and all the like weird kind of fucked up ideas. Like there's a kind of shit in the head type of thing that, you know, it's like, it's just, there's so much shit, and right. The shit eventually kind of penetrates into the organism that's trying to get rid of it because there's so much of it. That's the pattern. That's what happened in that first like, you know, bacterial cell situation that Margulis points out. And we're in the same situation now. Like all this weird crap is entering the food supply, and like all the air that we breathe has like little plastic particles and a little bit of radiation here and there. And it's just like all the shit that we produced is kind of coming back to us now. And it's just, that's the way life is. You know, is that the fault of the elites? I mean,
I think
yes and no.
At a certain point, it's. I like your analogy a lot, but I think at a certain point, we don't have to put ourselves in the category of the same natural order because we've taken ourselves out of it. We can see we can see the accumulation of shit and know that we got to get away from it. We can see those microbes didn't necessarily know to get together and say, hey, look, if we all keep shitting all this oxygen and we're going to all die, we're in a different situation. We can see that we've known about the petroleum linked to climate change for a long time, for like my whole life. You know what I mean? And the people that were profiting from it knew about it the whole time. Right. And a lot of other people knew it was a bad thing to do. Like we've known that the nuclear thing was a dangerous thing the whole time. So I feel like we need to put ourselves into a slightly different category and say, we might be wise enough to see what's going on. And not just have it happen to us.
All right, I'm gonna challenge that idea if you don't mind. So,
otherwise, we're just waiting around for the world, the universe, to just happen to us.
Well, okay. So, what would have happened if we had, completely, if we had retooled our industrial economy at the point where we realized that fossil fuels were becoming a real problem, right? Because it's like most systems. You have this infrastructure that's built, and there's sort of like a balance of power that's built upon that. And yeah, I'm sure that greed played a big role in there as well, and self-interest and all that kind of stuff. But we've gotten to the point now where I think most of the serious analysts in the field say, hey, you know what? Renewable energy is a great idea, but it's not going to fucking work. It's just on a return on investment level. You cannot get the kind of energy necessary to run the civilization that we have using renewable energy. Now, do I trust them? Okay, let's say when I listen to people talking about their area of expertise, I rely on a degree of gut instinct. So there was a recent interview on Chris Martinson's show that I should remember the name of, and I can't. And it was with a guy who's a geologist who lives in Louisiana. Martinson's show is called Peak Prosperity. He's a guy who's been in the energy industry for a long time, and he has a lot of, I would say, just basic nuts and bolts kinds of way of analyzing things. And it sounds like he's not one of these guys who's trying to push some kind of a scheme. So to me, he was a credible witness, you could say. And yeah, he's one of these guys, like many of them that I've heard, who basically, like, when you crunch the numbers, renewables aren't going to do it. So, okay, even back in the 70s and 80s where they started to be aware of the kinds of problems that we were going to see with fossil fuels, we didn't have the renewable energy developed to the point we have it now. So I'm pretty sure that at that point it would have been like, okay, we've got this system and it has to keep running, because if it doesn't, it's like, not only are we all screwed, but like pretty much everyone in the whole system is screwed. And it's completely dependent upon the stuff that we're producing, right? The oil. I mean, one of the things that this guy said that was really interesting is that oil has always been a loss proposition. Like, people talk about how fracking, it always, it's you're operating at a loss, right? He says, you know what? When it really comes down to it, the whole industry has always been operating at a loss. It's like hard to believe, right? But
I guess I have to understand the context in which that makes sense, because you can point to profits. I mean, the whole point of money is as a placeholder for energy, right?
Sort of, yeah.
Or value. Something is of value.
Well, you could say that it's some kind of energy conversion, like some form of energy has been turned into it. Although I heard one person say that what it really is land development is a good way of thinking of it. But
sure,
basically,
you could also think of it as future labor. Because if you have money and I don't, and I need that money to buy food, then you own my future labor.
Yeah, but I guess that doesn't describe where it comes from, right? Because
money.
Yeah, like how is the money? I guess you could say it's the labor necessary in order to extract the resource from the land. So there's that element of it.
You could also think of it just as a placeholder of power.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. Power is a rough word. Energy is non-specific, but also points in the right direction. But
like energy it can be potential, right? So energy is like a reserve that could be used but isn't necessarily being used.
Right, so if we think of money as a potential energy well, if you will.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe. Sure.
Right. Because you lift a ball off of the earth. It has some potential energy. You let it go and it falls.
Right.
Right. If I have some money and I want to get something done, and you don't have money, then
you can let that money go.
Thing done, and it turns into activity. Right?
Yeah.
And it just keeps going around, and we just keep doing our activities. But what we're saying is that the activity of having drawn that oil out of the ground and turned it into something that we can all burn, has produced all of this potential energy that is now in the hands of a few individuals and corporations. So what that says to me is that they now have the power to tell us what to do because they did that.
Well, okay, so what's power then? If I don't
have food, and I need that money to get food, then they have the power to tell me how to work and what to do to get that money to get that food. That's basically how our society works, unless we're one of the 1% of the planet that's sort of living in an indigenous fashion in some corner of the jungle.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really argue with that. Without a doubt, the monetary system is a system of control, a system of power, without a doubt.
So let's go back for a second, because I interrupted you, but I want to bring you back on track.
Okay, good, because I can't remember where we are.
The whole concept of let's see where we were talking about. Oh, the renewable energy.
Oh, yeah.
Not being enough to run our system. If you were to take a step back and say, well, wait a second, why is that the bar we have to get over? Because our current system, we're doing a lot of things that aren't actually benefiting us materially.
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely true. Like
if you look at how much we spend on the military-industrial complex and how much energy, human energy, is put into that, if we weren't required to build the machinery of our destruction to the tunes of billions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars.
Yeah, I think that
then would
the leap of faith necessary in order to dismantle the military thing at this particular point in time, it's like I could have envisioned that maybe after the fall of the wall in Berlin. You know, like when the Soviet Union collapsed, it seemed like that was our golden moment.
That was the moment to step back from the brink.
It didn't happen. It did not happen, and there's been really an escalation of military. It's not just the United States. You know, around the world, people are arming themselves pretty freaking hardcore. So I don't see how that would work at this point. But, I mean, it's sort of like the gun thing. It's like, yeah, ideally this would be a world without guns. But there's so many freaking guns. You know, it's like that is actually the world we're living in, pragmatically speaking. How are you going to deal with a world bristling with weapons without any weapons? It's like, you know,
right. No,
okay.
We have some seriously difficult challenges.
And one of the challenges we're confronted with right now is that we're already at 56 minutes and 35 seconds. And I don't want to have to edit this into two pieces again. You know, it's just painful. And I really think that going over an hour is really too much. It's just amazing that anyone listens to these as they are. So we've done about an hour now. Can we find some way to sew this up? Is there some kind of thematic flourish we can do here? Or should we just plunge ourselves into a room of reverb and, you know, with... At the loss of having anything else to offer on the subject, just make some ambient sounds and hope for the best.
Yeah, I think that we've come a little ways on a conversation that's going to have many installations, and it's important for everybody to start having conversations that mean something.
Amen. Yeah, we're not going to run out of things to talk about for a long time to come.
No, because we don't know what's going on.
No idea.
We really don't.
And that's as it should be.
I guess. I don't know. I mean, I'd like there to be mystery, but I think that's what great mystery is there for, in that we have a million years of being able to work on that one without necessarily coming to a conclusion. But how to, not destroy the planet and enslave all the people in the process, I feel like we ought to be able to figure that one out.
It's not totally destroyed yet.
It's not totally destroyed, and we're not totally enslaved. But it looks like that's the effort that's underway.
Well, but maybe that's just what it looks like.
Exactly. Maybe that's the kind of pressure that we need to actually develop to our next stage.
It's quite possible. So it may be that actually the threat of being obliterated is what drives us to innovate. You know? So, okay, so be it. Let's figure it out.
And yeah, we just kept talking. But I hit the stop button, so who knows what happened after that. Okay. I hope you enjoyed the show.
Thanks for listening. We look forward to serving you again soon. In the meantime, remember, turn that thing over a few times before you pick it up and take it home.